Herero and Nama Genocide. There is a quiet farm in Namibia that looks like any other piece of land, except the dirt has a memory, and what lies beneath it predates the Holocaust by decades. Germany had already tested the logic of the camps in Africa, long before the camps became a global symbol of horror. In 1904, the Herero people rose against German colonial rule after years of watching their land and cattle being taken. At some point, they decided enough was enough. Then, Germany responded by sending General Lothar von Trotha, who didn't come to negotiate. On October 2, 1904, he signed and circulated the Vernichtungsbefehl, the extermination order. It was direct and brutally clear. It read, "Every Herero, with or without a rifle, with or without cattle, will be shot. I no longer accept women or younger people. I will drive them back to their people or have them shot." Then came the calculated part. At the Battle of Waterberg, von Trotha surrounded about 50,000 Herero men, women, and younger people on a plateau. Then, he deliberately left one path open that looked like an escape route. If you were there, you probably would have taken it too. The path led into the Omaheke Desert, and as people fled, German forces poisoned and sealed the water sources along the way. They turned that escape into a death trap where tens of thousands died, slowly, from thirst. Those who somehow survived and turned back were shot on sight or sent to concentration camps. These were some of the first concentration camps run by a modern European state. Shark Island became the most infamous, with about 80% of prisoners dying there. A doctor named Eugen Fischer carried out experiments on inmates. His racial science directly shaped the ideology that later produced figures like Joseph Mengele. By 1908, the Herero population had collapsed from 80,000 to 16,000. The Nama people, who resisted separately and received their own extermination order in 1905, lost roughly half of their population as well. Germany officially recognized this as a genocide in 2021, offered development aid instead of reparations, and didn't consult the descendants of the victims before doing so. Even now, the story is not fully settled. The Wola Massacre, Warsaw. On August 1, 1944, in Warsaw, the Polish Home Army launched an uprising trying to free the city from German occupation before Soviet forces arrived. For a moment, it felt like a turning point, like maybe this could work. But then Heinrich Himmler stepped in, and everything changed. He issued an order that had nothing to do with military tactics. The order was simple. Every inhabitant of Warsaw was to be killed, and the city itself was to be erased. Now, here is the part that tells you exactly what kind of operation this was. Normally, armies are made up of trained soldiers who follow rules, even in war. But for this, Himmler didn't want discipline. He wanted people who had already crossed every line. So for this, he brought in the Durlawanger Brigade, a unit built from convicted criminals and SS soldiers punished for extreme violence, as well as the Rona Brigade, collaborators who had already participated in mass killings and proven clearly that they would turn on civilians without hesitation. The instructions were straightforward. No prisoners, no survivors. On August 5, 1944, they moved through the Wola district, house by house, pulling civilians into courtyards and shooting them in groups. Patients were killed in their hospital beds. The doctors and nurses trying to help them were executed. Priests were shot where they stood. In the first days alone, about 6,000 to 8,000 people were killed each day. On August 12, 1944, Himmler arrived and complained it wasn't happening quickly enough. In 1 week, around 40,000 to 50,000 civilians were killed in Wola alone. This was one of the largest mass killings of civilians in any single European city during the entire Second World War. When the Warsaw Uprising finally ended on October 2, 1944, approximately 200,000 Polish civilians had died. Every August 1st, at 5 p.m., Warsaw turns into a ghost city. The sirens wail, and for 60 seconds, time simply stops. They aren't just standing in silence. They are standing on the ruins of a capital the world was told would never exist again. French torture in Algeria. For years, France avoided a single word. It didn't call what was happening in Algeria a war. Instead, it was described as operations to maintain a public order, a phrase that sounded controlled and reasonable. And it stayed that way until 1999, when it was finally recognized as a war. This was no accident, because it helped to hide what was actually happening inside those operations. The French army built a systematic torture program against Algerian FLN suspects and civilians. The methods were taught in military manuals and approved at the command level. When they brought someone in for interrogation, the process was standardized. This included electric shocks applied to your ears, gums, and genitals, and waterboarding sessions where they made you feel like you were drowning over and over again. They hung people from ceiling beams, beat them, and then put them in stress positions for hours, or sometimes days, in rooms where nobody outside could hear anything. During the Battle of Algiers, in October of 1957, one single division of the French military put between 30,000 and 40,000 Algerians through that system. Now imagine you are one of those people. You've been in that room for days. You've told them everything you know or everything you could think to say just to make it stop. And now the interrogation is over. But you cannot be released because you've seen the inside of that room. You know what they are doing there, and they cannot have you walking around outside with that information. So they move you on to the last procedure. They sedate you and put you on a military aircraft. Then they throw you out of an airplane, alive, over the ocean or over remote mountain ranges. Soldiers who did this talked about it afterwards in books and interviews using one word: routine. France admitted in 2018 that torture had been an official part of its military operations in Algeria. No apology, no compensation. Just a quiet statement 60 years after the fact, from a government that had spent 6 decades making sure the paperwork never quite said the word war. The Bangladesh Genocide. On the night of March 25, 1971, while most people were asleep, Pakistani army units simultaneously moved into the city. Each unit headed somewhere specific, like they already knew exactly where to go and who to find. At first, they entered the University of Dhaka, walked into dormitories where students were sleeping, and killed students and faculty where they slept, targeting Hindu residents and Bengali nationalists alike. From there, they moved into Shankaripoti, a tightly packed Hindu neighborhood, and set the entire streets on fire, turning homes into traps people couldn't escape. Another group stormed the police headquarters and killed the Bengali officers inside. By the time the sun came up, thousands were dead, and whole sections of the city had already been torn apart. And this was only the beginning. At the time, East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, had just won a democratic election by a huge margin in 1970. But the central government refused to accept the result, and when talks failed, the army launched Operation Searchlight. Over the next 9 months, soldiers moved through towns and villages targeting Hindu civilians, political supporters, and Bengali intellectuals. Just days before the war ended in December, groups carried out planned killings of professors, journalists, doctors, and engineers in Dhaka. Bangladesh still remembers them as martyred intellectuals. There was also widespread intimate violence, documented even at the time. Between 200,000 and 400,000 women and girls were violated, and many were held in the military camps for months. The estimated total death toll ranged from hundreds of thousands to approximately 3 million. In April of 1971, one U.S. diplomat, Archer Blood, reported what was happening and formally protested. He was ignored, and his report was later declassified. The diplomat who told the truth was punished, but the men who suppressed it were not. East Timor. On December 6, 1975, U.S. President Gerald Ford and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger flew to Jakarta and met with Indonesian President Suharto. They were briefed on a planned military invasion of East Timor, a small island that had just declared independence after 450 years as a Portuguese colony. The next morning, December 7th, Indonesia launched an invasion. What followed was 24 years of occupation. In the first months, Indonesian forces moved through villages, executing civilians and destroying food supplies. The town of Ailu had around 5,000 people before the invasion, and in less than a year, only about 1,000 remained. Over the full occupation, deaths were estimated between roughly 90,000 and over 200,000, with many sources pointing to around 200,000. This was about 1/3 of the island's entire population before the invasion. Then, on November 12, 1991, something changed dramatically. Thousands of people had gathered at a cemetery in Dili for a funeral procession. They were mourning a young independence supporter who had been killed days earlier. As they moved through the streets and entered the cemetery, Indonesian soldiers were already there waiting. Without warning, they opened fire on the crowd. People ran, stumbled, tried to hide among the graves, but there was nowhere to go. The shooting continued as civilians tried to escape, and within minutes, the ground was filled with at least 250 to 270 bodies. This time, it was filmed. The footage was smuggled out and shown to the world, and for many people, it was the first time they truly saw what had been happening in East Timor. The Tigray War. In 2022, most of the world's attention was fixed on the war between Ukraine and Russia. Daily updates, constant coverage, and breaking news filled the airwaves. You could follow it in real time, but at the same time, another conflict was unfolding in northern Ethiopia, and most people never even heard about it. Researchers later estimated that between 300,000 and 600,000 people died. That made it the deadliest conflict on Earth that year, deadlier even than several other wars combined, and yet it barely showed up on most screens. The war had started in November 2020, when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who had won the Nobel Peace Prize just a year earlier, launched a military response against the Tigray People's Liberation Front. What followed pulled in multiple forces, including Eritrean troops and regional militias. Civilians were massacred, systematic violence was used against Tigrayan women and girls, and food aid was blocked while famine spread. By mid-2022, hundreds of thousands of people were already facing starvation, and still, access was cut off, journalists were kept out, and communication networks were shut down. Even UN staff were expelled, which meant very little of this was ever seen as it happened. Later investigations pointed to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even evidence that met the definition of genocide. But Ethiopia and Eritrea deny the findings. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost in the conflict, all while the world was watching something else, and the people responsible were never prosecuted.